What would you do if you found a hidden room in your house? For me, it started with a loose floorboard and ended with a discovery that turned my world upside down. What I found inside changed everything I thought I knew about my home and my family. When I bought my Victorian house 6 months ago, I thought I'd struck gold. The place had charm, bay windows, intricate molding, and a wraparound porch straight out of a storybook. Sure, it had quirks, pipes that groaned like a horror movie sound effect, drafty windows that let in the chill no matter how high I cranked the heat, and floors that creaked under even the lightest step. But those quirks felt like part of its personality. I told myself they added to its vintage charm. That's why, when I noticed one particular floorboard in the upstairs hallway creaking more than usual, I didn't think much of it. At least, not at first. One evening, I was cleaning the hallway, swiping my broom across the dusty wooden floors, when the board caught my eye. It shifted slightly under the pressure of the broom, almost as if it were loose. I crouched down to inspect it and noticed a faint outline around the edges, barely visible in the fading light. It wasn't just a creaky board, it was different. My curiosity got the better of me. I went to the kitchen, grabbed a flathead screwdriver, and returned to the hallway. Carefully, I wedged the screwdriver into the gap and pried the board up. It came loose with surprising ease, revealing a dark, hollow space beneath it. I leaned in closer, holding my breath as I brushed away layers of dust and debris. My fingers hit something cold and metallic, an iron ring embedded in the wood. It was attached to what appeared to be a small trapdoor. My heart raced as I stared at it. A trapdoor? In my house. I'd never seen anything about this in the inspection report, and the realtor certainly hadn't mentioned it. What could possibly be underneath? I hesitated for a moment, debating whether I should open it. It felt like the kind of decision people in horror movies regret making, the one that leads to whispers of, they should have left it alone. But I wasn't in a horror movie. This was my house, and I wasn't going to let some old trapdoor intimidate me. I grabbed the iron ring and pulled. The trapdoor creaked open, the sound echoing eerily in the empty hallway. A musty smell wafted up, and I peered down into the darkness below. A narrow wooden staircase descended into what looked like a hidden space, a secret room that I never knew existed. For a moment, I just stared, trying to process what I was seeing. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it an old root cellar? A storage space? Or something more sinister? Grabbing a flashlight from my bedroom, I aimed the beam down the stairs. The light illuminated rough stone walls, cobwebs stretching like curtains across the space. The air was heavy, the kind of damp chill that seeps into your bones. Whatever this room was, it hadn't been disturbed in a very long time. Taking a deep breath, I stepped onto the first creaky stair, bracing myself for what I might find below. Little did I know, opening that trapdoor was about to change everything I thought I knew about my house and my life. The creak of the trapdoor was loud enough to echo down the dark staircase it revealed. A musty, stale air billowed up, carrying with it the scent of damp wood and something faintly metallic. My stomach churned with a mix of unease and excitement. This was my house, yet it suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else, a place holding secrets I wasn't sure I was ready to uncover. I shone the flashlight down the narrow wooden staircase. The steps were worn, each one sagging slightly in the middle, as if they had borne the weight of countless footsteps long ago. The walls were rough stone, uneven and cold, with thick cobwebs draped in the corners. The space below was shrouded in shadow, the flashlight beam revealing only fragments at a time. For a moment, I hesitated at the top of the stairs. What was this place? An old storage room? A root cellar? Or something worse? The rational part of my brain reminded me that this was my house. I had nothing to fear from a hidden room, but a nagging voice in the back of my mind whispered otherwise. What if you're not supposed to find this? Summoning my courage, I stepped onto the first stair. It groaned loudly under my weight, sending a chill down my spine. Each step creaked louder than the last as I descended, the air growing colder and heavier with every inch. By the time I reached the bottom, my breath was visible in front of me, a small cloud of white in the dim light. The room I stepped into was small, no bigger than a walk-in closet. The floor was packed dirt, uneven and gritty beneath my shoes. The walls were lined with stone, damp to the touch and slick in places where water had seeped through the cracks. Dust hung in the air, thick enough to coat the back of my throat with every breath. In the center of the room was a small wooden table with a single chair, both covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. The table had two objects on it, a stack of yellowed papers tied neatly with twine, and a small, rusted box secured with a padlock. I approached the table cautiously, shining the flashlight over the items as if they might spring to life. The papers were fragile, their edges curling with age. I could see faint writing on them, but the words were too faded to read without closer inspection. My hands itched to untie the twine and unfold them, but the locked box caught my attention first. It was made of tarnished metal, its surface etched with faint designs that had faded over time. The padlock was small but sturdy, and I couldn't see any way to open it without a key. I picked it up, feeling its surprising weight, and shook it gently. Something rattled inside. Setting the box back down, I turned my attention to the papers. Carefully, I untied the twine, letting it fall away in brittle loops. The top sheet had writing scrawled across it in dark, spidery ink. The words were old-fashioned, the letters slanted and ornate, but I could still make them out. To whoever finds this, what lies below should have stayed hidden. I froze, the flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. What did that mean? My eyes darted back to the box, then to the rest of the stack of papers. My instincts told me to leave, to reseal the trapdoor and pretend I had never found this place. But my curiosity had already taken hold. I picked up the next sheet of paper, my pulse racing as I began to read. The notes were part diary, part confession. Whoever had written them was hiding something, a secret they had buried here, quite literally, beneath the floorboards of my house. The pages spoke of an object, something powerful and dangerous, that needed to be kept out of the wrong hands. One line stuck out to me in particular: "I pray this will remain undisturbed. But if it is found, beware the consequences of opening the box." My gaze snapped back to the rusted box on the table, its padlock glinting faintly in the flashlight's beam. What could possibly be inside? And why would someone go to such lengths to hide it? I wanted answers, but a deep unease crept over me. The words in the notes weren't just warnings, they felt like a plea. Whoever had written them had been desperate to protect something, or maybe to protect others from it. I glanced back at the staircase, the faint light from the hallway above barely visible. My gut told me to go back up, to seal the trapdoor, and never look back. But my curiosity was stronger than my fear. With trembling hands, I picked up the box again, running my fingers over its intricate surface. I didn't have a key, but I would find a way to open it. Whatever was inside had been hidden for a reason, and I was determined to uncover the truth, even if it changed everything. With the flashlight propped precariously on the edge of the table, I gently untied the stack of yellowed papers. The twine crumbled slightly in my fingers, brittle with age, and fell away in fragile loops. My hands trembled as I unfolded the top sheet, its edges curling and the ink faint but legible. The handwriting was old-fashioned, the kind you might see in letters from the early 20th century. Each word was written with care, slanted and flowing, like a relic from a different world. The first few lines drew me in immediately. "Dearest Evelyn, I think of you constantly. Your smile haunts me, even in the darkest hours of the night. I count the days until we can be together again, truly together, without fear or secrecy." The letter was signed simply with the initials CM. I paused, staring at those letters, trying to make sense of what I was reading. Who was Evelyn? And who was CM? As I read through the rest of the letters, the story began to unfold. They were love notes, passionate, poetic, and painfully romantic. CM wrote about secret meetings by the river, stolen kisses in moonlight, and plans to leave everything behind and run away together. The tone was hopeful at first, filled with longing and anticipation. But as I moved through the stack, the letters grew darker. The joy in CM's words gave way to fear and desperation. One letter described how Evelyn's family had discovered their relationship and forbade her from seeing him again. Another hinted at threats, both subtle and overt, against them. The final letter made my chest tighten with dread. "My love, I fear the worst is upon us. They will not allow us to be together, no matter how hard we fight. If you find this, if you are reading these words, then you'll know the truth. Remember, Evelyn, where the heart rests. That is where you will find me." I read the last line over and over, trying to decipher its meaning. It felt like a clue, though to what, I couldn't be sure. Setting the letters aside, I turned my attention to the box. It was small and made of tarnished metal, with faint etchings along its sides that were difficult to make out under the dim flashlight beam. The rusted padlock was stubborn, its surface corroded from years of neglect. I tried to open it with brute force, tugging at the lock until my fingers ached, but it wouldn't budge. My heart pounded as I searched the room for anything that might help. Finally, I used a flathead screwdriver I'd brought down with me to pry at the hinges. It took nearly an hour of effort, but eventually, the lock gave way with a sharp snap. With bated breath, I lifted the lid. Inside the box was a faded photograph, its corners worn and its surface slightly yellowed. I held it up to the light, squinting to make out the details. The photo showed a man and a woman standing together in front of what looked like my house, though the porch and garden were vastly different, untouched by time and renovation. The woman was labeled Evelyn in neat handwriting along the edge of the photo. She was beautiful, with dark curls and a soft smile, dressed in the elegant style of the early 1900s. The man standing next to her was tall and lean, with sharp features and piercing eyes. There was no label for him, but my stomach twisted when I realized why he looked so familiar. He bore an uncanny resemblance to the man in an old family portrait that hung in my parents' house. The same portrait my mother once told me was of her great-grandfather. I sat there in stunned silence, the photograph trembling slightly in my hands. How was this possible? If the man in the photo was my ancestor, then Evelyn had some connection to my family. But what was it? I glanced back at the letters, then at the photograph. Suddenly, the phrase from the last letter echoed in my mind, "Where the heart rests." It felt like a puzzle waiting to be solved, a clue left behind by someone desperate to be found. My pulse quickened as I realized that this wasn't just an old love story. It was personal. Somewhere in this house, Evelyn's story was waiting to be uncovered, and I was determined to find it. The resemblance between the man in the photograph and the portrait of my great-grandfather hung in the back of my mind, gnawing at me. It wasn't just the sharp jawline or piercing eyes. It was the way he held himself, a quiet confidence that seemed unmistakable. Could it really be him? That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that Evelyn and CM's story was somehow connected to my family. I sat at my kitchen table, the photograph and letters spread out in front of me, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. I needed answers, and there was only one person who might have them, my mom. When she picked up, her voice was warm but surprised. "Hey, what's going on? You don't usually call this late." I took a deep breath. "Mom, I need to ask you something. Do you know the name Evelyn? Or someone with the initials CM?" There was a pause, long enough for my heart to start racing. "Where did you hear those names?" she asked finally, her tone shifting to something I couldn't quite place. Was it caution? Or fear? Her reaction sent a chill down my spine. "I found them in some letters," I explained, keeping my voice steady. "They were hidden under a trapdoor in my house." "Mom, the letters are addressed to someone named Evelyn, and they mention CM. It's strange." Another pause. Then she sighed, her voice dropping to a whisper. "That's part of our family's history we don't talk about." "What do you mean?" I pressed, gripping the phone tighter. "Evelyn was your great-great-aunt," she said. "She disappeared when she was young, and no one knows what happened to her. It was a scandal back then. The family tried to bury it." Her words hit me like a freight train. Evelyn wasn't just a name in some old letters. She was family. And somehow, her story had been erased, hidden away like a shameful secret. "What happened to her?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know all the details," Mom admitted. "But from what little I've heard, she fell in love with someone her family didn't approve of. They tried to stop her, but she refused to listen. Then, one day, she was just gone. No one ever saw her again." My mind raced as I connected the dots. The letters from CM spoke of forbidden love and plans to run away. Could Evelyn have disappeared because of her relationship with him? "Mom, do you know who CM was?" I asked, my heart pounding. "No," she said after a moment. "But if I had to guess, I'd say he was the man she was involved with. Her family was furious when they found out about him. They said he was after her inheritance or something like that." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The story of Evelyn's disappearance wasn't just a mystery. It was a scandal, a piece of my family's history that had been deliberately buried. "I think he's connected to this house," I said, glancing at the photograph on the table. "There's a picture of Evelyn with a man standing in front of my house. And Mom, he looks like the man in the portrait at Grandma's house." For the first time, my mom sounded genuinely unsettled. "Are you saying CM might have been part of our families?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But it feels like there's more to this story. Evelyn wrote something in her letters. It's cryptic, but she said, 'Where the heart rests.' Does that mean anything to you?" She was silent for a long time. "I don't know," she said finally. "But maybe it's a clue." After we hung up, I sat at the table, staring at the photograph and letters with a new sense of urgency. Evelyn wasn't just some stranger with a tragic love story. She was part of my history, my bloodline. And now, it felt like it was up to me to uncover the truth. Why had Evelyn's story been erased? What had really happened to her and CM? And what did her cryptic message mean? My house held the key to the answers, I was sure of it. And I wasn't going to stop until I found them. I couldn't shake the gravity of what I had uncovered. Evelyn wasn't just a name on a page. She was family. Someone my great-grandparents had chosen to erase from our history, to bury in whispers and shame. Her story felt like a puzzle with missing pieces, and I was determined to put it back together. That night, I began my search. Armed with my laptop and a growing sense of determination, I dug into every online archive I could find. Evelyn's name yielded a handful of results in old newspapers from the early 1900s. The articles painted a picture of a socialite adored by everyone who knew her. She was described as radiantly beautiful, with a wit and charm that drew people in effortlessly. Evelyn had been the daughter of a prominent family, her every move chronicled in society columns. There were mentions of her hosting grand parties, attending galas, and even performing in charity concerts. But as I read further, the tone of the articles began to shift. One article caught my attention immediately. It announced Evelyn's engagement to a man named Thomas Barrington, a wealthy businessman with ties to the railroad industry. According to the piece, the match had been arranged by their families and was considered a perfect union of power and beauty. But the words felt hollow, almost clinical. I found a follow-up article from a few months later that painted a very different picture. The engagement had been called off abruptly, with no explanation provided. Sources close to the family cite irreconcilable differences, it read, though the phrasing felt like an elegant way of saying something had gone very wrong. Then came the most chilling discovery, an article about Evelyn's disappearance. It was brief, almost dismissive, buried in the back pages of the newspaper. Miss Evelyn Carter, 24, has not been seen for 3 days, it read. Her family is offering a reward for any information regarding her whereabouts. There were no follow-ups, no resolutions. It was as if Evelyn had vanished into thin air. The more I read, the more questions I had. Why had she disappeared? Had she run away? Or had something happened to her? The initials, CM, kept circling in my mind. I searched for anything that could connect them to Evelyn, but the trail was cold, until I stumbled across a name. Charles Monroe. Charles was a local artist, well known in the same circles Evelyn frequented. He had a reputation as a talented painter, but the articles about him hinted at a darker side. One piece described him as a charming rogue who had allegedly seduced several wealthy women. Another outright accused him of preying on vulnerable socialites, using their connections and money to fund his art. Could Charles Monroe have been CM? The letters suggested he and Evelyn had been deeply in love, but the articles painted him as a manipulative opportunist. Which version of him was true? I found myself staring at the photograph again. Evelyn's soft smile and relaxed posture suggested she had been happy in that moment. Charles, if that was who the man in the picture truly was, stood beside her with an almost protective air. It didn't match the predatory image painted by the articles. But then I thought back to the final letter. CM had written, "If you find this, you'll know the truth." Was it a plea for understanding? Or a warning? I turned back to the locket and the phrase from Evelyn's last note, "Where the heart rests." It felt like a clue, but I still couldn't piece it together. Could she have hidden something in the house? My thoughts were interrupted by a realization that made my stomach twist. If Evelyn's family had gone to such lengths to erase her from history, what would they have done to keep her from leaving with someone like Charles Monroe? The possibilities were endless and terrifying. I had only scratched the surface of the mystery, but I already knew one thing for sure. Evelyn's disappearance wasn't an accident. Someone had wanted her gone. I was determined to find out why. And the answers, I felt certain, were still waiting for me within the walls of my house. The letters and photograph had opened a door into Evelyn's world, but I felt there was more to uncover. Something about the hidden room tugged at me, a sense that it still held secrets, waiting to be revealed. So, I returned, flashlight in hand, determined to leave no stone unturned. The narrow staircase groaned under my weight as I descended, the cold, musty air enveloping me once again. The room looked as it had before, a dusty table, a lone chair, and the faint hum of forgotten time lingering in the air. But this time, I noticed something I hadn't before. One of the bricks in the wall, near the far corner, was slightly ajar. Its edges didn't line up perfectly with the others, and there was a faint gap at the top, just wide enough to slip a finger through. My heart quickened as I crouched down to inspect it. I grabbed the flathead screwdriver I'd brought with me and worked it into the gap, using it to wiggle the brick loose. It took a bit of force, but eventually, the brick slid out, revealing a small compartment hidden behind it. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and worn from age. My hands trembled as I pulled it out, brushing off a layer of dust. The journal felt heavy, as if it contained the weight of Evelyn's untold story. I climbed back up the stairs, unable to wait another second. Sitting at my kitchen table, I carefully opened the journal, its brittle pages crackling under my fingers. The handwriting inside was the same as the letters, elegant and fluid, but with a hurried, emotional edge that grew more pronounced as the entries went on. The first pages painted a vivid picture of Evelyn's life. She wrote about lavish parties, suffocating societal expectations, and her growing resentment toward the rigid world she was born into. Then she wrote about Charles. The first time I saw him, I felt as though the air had shifted around me. One entry read, "He was different from anyone I'd ever met, charming, yes, but there was something deeper, something real. He looked at me as though I were a person, not just another ornament in my father's collection." As I read, their love story unfolded in a way that felt almost cinematic. She wrote about their secret meetings in the gardens, stolen moments in the moonlight, and whispered promises of a future together. But the tone of the journal changed abruptly as the entries progressed. Evelyn began to write of feeling watched, of the pressure her family was placing on her to end her relationship with Charles. Her father, in particular, loomed large in her writings, a stern, controlling figure who seemed willing to go to any lengths to keep her under his thumb. One entry sent chills down my spine. "Father told me today that Charles is not what he seems. He claims he is proof that Charles is using me, that he's done the same to others. But I know my father too well. He would say anything to keep me from leaving. Still, I cannot shake this seed of doubt he has planted." The final entries were frantic, her words scrawled in uneven lines that hinted at her growing fear. Evelyn wrote of strange occurrences, letters that went missing, whispers in the halls at night, and veiled threats from her family. "I feel as though the walls are closing in," she wrote. "Everywhere I turn, there are eyes watching, ears listening. I cannot trust anyone but Charles. Yet, even he seems different lately. Distant. As though he is hiding something from me." The final entry stopped me cold. "If something happens to me, the truth is hidden where the heart rests. I can only hope that someone will find it and understand." The phrase echoed in my mind, just as it had from the letters. Where the heart rests. I sat back, staring at the journal in silence. Evelyn's words were a desperate plea for someone to uncover what had happened to her. But what did she mean by "where the heart rests"? Was it a metaphor? Or a literal clue? My eyes wandered back to the photograph I had found earlier, the one of Evelyn and Charles standing in front of my house. The house. Could the answer be somewhere within these walls? I felt a renewed sense of determination. Evelyn's story wasn't just a forgotten piece of family history, it was a mystery that demanded to be solved. Somewhere in this house, the truth was waiting to be uncovered. And I was going to find it. The phrase, "where the heart rests," became an obsession, looping endlessly in my mind as I wandered through the house. Evelyn had left it behind like a breadcrumb, a deliberate clue for anyone who might uncover her story. But what did it mean? The cryptic message felt layered, its meaning just out of reach. I started with the obvious. I combed through the bedroom, checking behind furniture, inside drawers, and even under the bed frame. Nothing. The hidden room was next, but after scouring its every corner, the dirt floor, the rough stone walls, the table, I came up empty again. Frustrated, I collapsed onto the living room couch, my eyes scanning the room for inspiration. That's when I noticed it, the fireplace. It was bricked up and used for decades, with soot-streaked bricks that stood out starkly against the pale walls. I'd always assumed it was just part of the house's quirks, something long out of use and forgotten. But now, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. The hearth. The phrase clicked into place. Where the heart rests. Was it a play on words? If Evelyn had hidden something, could it be here, behind the bricks? Grabbing a flashlight and a crowbar, I knelt in front of the fireplace and got to work. The bricks were old, their mortar crumbling under the force of the crowbar. Each one came loose with a heavy groan, releasing puffs of dust and soot into the air. My arms ached, but I couldn't stop. Brick by brick, I dismantled the facade, revealing a hollow cavity behind the hearth. Inside, my flashlight beam illuminated a small bundle wrapped in cloth, tucked into the back corner of the opening. My pulse quickened as I reached in, the coarse fabric gritty, with soot as I pulled it free. Whatever was inside was heavier than I expected. I unwrapped the bundle carefully, the cloth falling away to reveal a small tin box, its surface tarnished but intact. The lid was slightly dented, and it groaned faintly as I pried it open with shaking hands. The first thing I saw was a gold locket, glinting faintly in the dim light. It was delicate, with intricate engravings curling along its edges and the initials E.C. Evelyn Carter, etched onto its surface. My breath caught as I turned it over in my hand, marveling at its craftsmanship and wondering what secrets it held. Inside the tin box was also a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age but remarkably well-preserved. I unfolded it gingerly, the edges brittle and fragile, and began to read. The note was written in Evelyn's unmistakable handwriting, her words hauntingly clear even after all these years. If you have found this, then my story is not lost. I pray you will understand. They silenced me, buried my truth beneath their lies. But love endures, even in the face of cruelty. The locket holds the key to my heart, and the truth of what was done to me. I stared at the locket, my heart pounding. What did Evelyn mean by the key to my heart? Was it figurative, or was there more to the locket than met the eye? The note continued, its tone shifting to something more urgent. Do not trust what they say about Charles. He was not perfect, but he was not the villain they painted him to be. They wanted to keep me, to control me, and when I resisted, they made me disappear. My family's legacy is built on lies, but you hold the truth now. Please, do not let it die here. Evelyn's words sent shivers down my spine. Her disappearance wasn't just a tragedy, it was deliberate, orchestrated by those closest to her. And Charles? The man my family had vilified for generations? According to Evelyn, he wasn't the villain of her story at all. I examined the locket again, running my fingers over its intricate design. A tiny latch on the side caught my attention, and I carefully pressed it. The locket clicked open, revealing a miniature painting inside, a portrait of Evelyn and Charles, their faces captured in delicate brushstrokes. Beneath the portrait was a small scrap of paper folded tightly. It took me several tries to extract it without tearing it, and when I finally unfolded it, I saw a single line scrawled across the page. The river holds what they could not bury. My blood ran cold. The river. Was Evelyn's body there? Or was it something else entirely? I stared at the locket, the note, and the tin box, my thoughts racing. Evelyn had entrusted these clues to the future, a desperate attempt to reveal the truth about her life and her death. And now it was up to me to finish what she started. The next step was clear. I had to find the river. And whatever it held, I knew it would change everything. The note tucked inside Evelyn's locket was only one sentence long, but it carried the weight of an entire life's tragedy. I was betrayed. Charles wasn't who I thought he was. Tell my story. Those words echoed in my mind as I sat at the kitchen table, the locket and its note laid out before me. Betrayal. Evelyn's letters and journal had painted Charles as the love of her life, a man who saw her for who she truly was in a world of rigid expectations and control. But now, this note hinted at a much darker possibility. Could Charles have played a role in her disappearance? Or was Evelyn manipulated into believing he had? I turned the locket over in my hands, studying the delicate engraving of Evelyn's initials. It felt like a relic of a love story gone terribly wrong. My heart ached for her, for the life she might have lived if her story hadn't been cut short. But I also felt a simmering anger at the secrets my family had kept, the deliberate erasure of Evelyn's life and the truth behind her disappearance. I decided it was time to confront my mom. I had pieced together enough to know that Evelyn's disappearance wasn't the result of simple misfortune. It was tied to the tangled web of my family's history, and I needed answers. I called her, barely able to keep my voice steady. "Mom, I found more," I said. The locket had a note inside. Evelyn said she was betrayed, and she wanted someone to tell her story. "What aren't you telling me?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When my mom finally spoke, her voice was soft and hesitant, as if she were trying to decide how much to reveal. I told you before, Evelyn's story isn't something we like to talk about, she said. But there are things I heard growing up. Whispers mostly. Rumors. Rumors about what? I pressed, my frustration bubbling to the surface. She was supposed to inherit everything, my mom said finally. The house, the family fortune, all of it. But when she disappeared, it changed everything. Her father, your great-great-grandfather, was obsessed with protecting the family's reputation. Some people say he orchestrated her disappearance to keep control of the money and land. Her words sent a chill down my spine. Are you saying her own family could have been involved? I don't know, my mom said, her voice cracking. But it wouldn't surprise me. Evelyn wasn't like the rest of them. She was headstrong, independent. She refused to play by their rules, and they saw her as a liability. I thought about the journal entries where Evelyn wrote about feeling watched and threatened, about her father's attempts to control her life. It all fit together too well to be a coincidence. What about Charles? I asked. Do you think he betrayed her? I don't know, she said again, but there was a note of doubt in her voice. From what I've heard, Charles was a complicated figure. Some people said he loved her, but others claimed he was after her money. After she disappeared, he left town and was never heard from again. Maybe he was heartbroken. Or maybe he knew something he didn't want to share. The possibility made my stomach churn. Evelyn's final note hinted at betrayal, but it wasn't clear who she had meant, Charles, her family, or someone else entirely. After the call, I sat in silence, piecing together everything I'd learned. Evelyn had been betrayed, her inheritance stolen, her love story shattered. And somehow, all of it was tied to my family's desperate need to protect their legacy. The locket and its note felt like breadcrumbs, leading me toward a truth that had been buried for over a century. But there was still one piece of Evelyn's message I hadn't deciphered. The river holds what they could not bury. I knew I had to follow that clue. Whatever Evelyn had hidden, or whoever had hidden it for her, was the missing link in this story. Grabbing the locket and the notes, I packed a bag and prepared for what I hoped would be the final step in uncovering Evelyn's truth. Somewhere out there, the river held the answers I needed, and I was determined to find them. Determined to untangle the final threads of Evelyn's story, I reached out to a local historian named Margaret. She had a reputation for solving long-forgotten mysteries and was known for her meticulous attention to detail. If anyone could help me make sense of Evelyn's disappearance, it was her. Margaret was immediately intrigued by my discovery. When I shared the letters, the journal, and the locket with her, she pored over them with the enthusiasm of someone uncovering buried treasure. This is extraordinary, she said, her voice tinged with awe. But tragic. Stories like Evelyn's are far too common. Women silenced by powerful families and forgotten by history. Together, we began piecing together Evelyn's life. Margaret had access to archives and documents I could never have found on my own, and her expertise shed light on details that had eluded me. Through her research, we uncovered a troubling timeline of events that painted a grim picture of Evelyn's fate. Shortly after Evelyn's disappearance, Charles Monroe had been arrested on suspicion of kidnapping. The police found letters between him and Evelyn, as well as reports from her father claiming Charles had been seen with her the night she vanished. But no solid evidence ever emerged. There were witnesses who swore Charles and Evelyn were planning to elope, Margaret explained, flipping through an old newspaper clipping. But without a body, and with Evelyn's family refusing to press the issue, the case fell apart. Charles was released after only a few days. What happened to him after that? I asked, leaning forward. Margaret pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose. He left town immediately. Some say he fled to avoid further suspicion. Others think he was heartbroken and couldn't bear to stay. Either way, he disappeared and was never seen again. Her words left me with a hollow feeling. If Charles had truly loved Evelyn, why hadn't he stayed to fight for her? But then Margaret handed me something that changed everything, a letter Charles had written after his release. The letter was a confession, though not in the way I expected. In it, Charles claimed that Evelyn's father had threatened him, demanding that he end their relationship and leave town. They told me I would lose everything if I didn't comply, Charles wrote. Her father was a man of power, and his threats were not idle. He paid me to disappear, to abandon Evelyn, and I took the money. It was the greatest mistake of my life. I never saw her again. The letter was damning. Evelyn's family hadn't just disapproved of Charles, they had actively sabotaged their relationship. And Charles, despite his claims of love, had accepted their terms. Whether out of fear, greed, or desperation. He had abandoned Evelyn when she needed him most. But the letter also raised new questions. If Charles had left, what had happened to Evelyn? Had she tried to escape on her own, only to meet a tragic end? Or had her family taken more drastic measures to ensure their reputation remained intact? Margaret and I continued digging, but the answers remained elusive. Evelyn's family had gone to great lengths to bury the story, ensuring that no trace of the scandal would tarnish their name. Records were missing, witnesses had vanished, and any mention of Evelyn in public archives abruptly stopped after her disappearance. The only clue we had left was Evelyn's cryptic message, "The river holds what they could not bury." I shared the phrase with Margaret, hoping she might have some insight. She sat back in her chair, her brow furrowed in thought. "The river," she murmured. "It could be literal. There are several rivers near your house, any of which could have been significant to Evelyn. Do you think she was—" I trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Margaret sighed. "It's possible, but it could also mean something else. The river might symbolize time, or the flow of truth. Either way, it's clear Evelyn left that clue for a reason." Armed with this new perspective, I felt both closer to the truth and more overwhelmed than ever. Evelyn's story was a tapestry of love, betrayal, and power, woven together with threads that were fraying at the edges. But one thing was certain: the river, whether literal or symbolic, was the key to finding the missing piece. The next day, I packed a bag with supplies and set out to explore the rivers near my house. Evelyn's voice echoed in my mind as I walked along the winding paths, the locket resting heavily in my pocket. I didn't know what I would find, but I knew this was my last chance to uncover the truth. Evelyn's story deserved an ending, and I was determined to give it to her. Evelyn's story stayed with me, lingering in my thoughts long after I pieced together the final threads. It wasn't just the tragedy of her disappearance or the betrayal she endured. It was the deliberate way her life had been erased, hidden under layers of family pride and secrecy. Her letters, her journal, the locket, they weren't just relics of a forgotten life. They were her voice, crying out from the past to be heard. And as heartbreaking as her story was, I knew it was now my responsibility to share it. Evelyn had been silenced once. I wouldn't let that happen again. With Margaret's help, we began the process of preserving and documenting everything I had found. She introduced me to archivists and historians, all of whom were captivated by the mystery of Evelyn Carter. Together, we pieced together a narrative that honored her memory and exposed the injustices she had suffered. Publishing Evelyn's story was no small feat. It began with a local historical journal, a lengthy article detailing the discovery of the hidden room, her letters, and the locket. From there, interest grew. Newspapers picked up the story, intrigued by the scandal that had remained buried for over a century. The hidden room in my house became a focal point of the tale, a symbol of the secrets families try to bury and the lengths they go to maintain appearances. Reporters and historians visited, photographing the small, dusty space and marveling at how it had gone unnoticed for so long. Evelyn's locket, with its miniature portrait and heartbreaking note, became an emblem of her resilience. Seeing it displayed in a glass case at a local museum was both bittersweet and cathartic. She was no longer a forgotten footnote in my family's history. She was a person, her life and legacy finally acknowledged. In the process of sharing Evelyn's story, I learned more about myself than I ever expected. Her courage in the face of control and oppression inspired me. Her determination to follow her heart, even when the odds were stacked against her, made me reflect on my own life and choices. The house, which had once felt heavy with secrets, now felt alive with purpose. I restored the hidden room, leaving it mostly as I'd found it, but adding a small plaque commemorating Evelyn's life and the story she left behind. Visitors often asked to see it, curious about the room that had held her secrets for so long. For me, the house no longer felt haunted. The creaks in the floorboards and the groans of the old pipes didn't unsettle me anymore. Instead, they felt like whispers of the past, echoes of a story that had finally found its voice. Evelyn's legacy became more than just a piece of history. It became a reminder of the importance of truth, no matter how deeply it's buried. Her story taught me that even the darkest secrets can eventually come to light, and that those who are silent still deserve to be heard. Today, I live in the house with a sense of peace I never thought possible. Evelyn is no longer a ghost in the walls. She's a presence, a part of the home's history that can never be erased again. As for my family, the revelations shook them in ways I didn't expect. Some were horrified by the lengths our ancestors had gone to protect their image. Others were more resistant, uncomfortable with the idea of exposing old skeletons. But in the end, they couldn't deny the truth. Evelyn's story deserved to be told, and I was proud to be the one to tell it. And as I walk through the halls of my house now, I feel a quiet sense of accomplishment. Evelyn's voice, silenced for so long, finally rings clear. Her legacy is no longer one of tragedy, but one of resilience, love, and the unrelenting pursuit of truth.